clear that the international community has to step up. As Prime Minister Motley of Barbados said in her impassioned address at the World Leaders Summit, actually, the pandemic has shown that national solutions to global problems just do not work, and that the community, the international community, really must get together to find a solution that does. As we know, building climate resilience is not just the right thing to do, but it's also the economically sound thing to do. The consensus opinion seems to be that there are returns for investing in climate resilience. And according to some assessments, actually, every dollar invested in climate resilience generates $4 in avoided losses. So as a community, we need to really move from responding to climate hazards after they happen to trying to address them before they hit. And of course, finance has a role to play, which is why Caribbean Development Bank President Jean Leon and EIB President Ricardo Mourinho have co-convened this panel today. And our distinguished panel will examine the unique climate challenges that Caribbean SIDS face, and more importantly, perhaps, explore solutions as to how we can try and address them. So it's my honor to introduce you to our panelists. We're joined by Dr. Jean Leon, who is President of the Caribbean Development Bank, and I would say whose leadership both in the Caribbean and globally needs no introduction. Then we have Vice President Ricardo Mourinho, who oversees all of the IB's financing in the Caribbean and also has responsibility and oversight for the blue economy, amongst other things, and just transition at the bank. Then Max Puig, who is Executive Vice President of the National Council for Climate Change and Clean Development for the Dominican Republic, and before that had a very distinguished career in politics and government in the Dominican Republic. And then lastly, but by no means least, joining us virtually is Her Excellency Małgorzata Wasilewska, and I hope I got the pronunciation of that correct, who is the EU Ambassador for Barbados, the OECS, and Regional Relations through CARICOM, and has previously served as EU Ambassador to Jamaica, Belize, and the Bahamas. So with that, the framing that I provided there, I'd like to kick off the discussion and turn to our panelists. And maybe, President Leon, if I can ask you first, at a time when the Caribbean region really as a whole is trying to deal with the fallout from the pandemic, what can multilateral financial institutions do to support Caribbean countries? Not only address those, but at the same time, tackle the very significant issue of climate change and resilience.
Thank you, Stephen. Maybe we should contextualize the issue at hand by recognizing that the Caribbean, at least, is in what we can characterize as a perfect storm. And I use the phrase perfect storm because it has three ingredients that capture the essence of the magnitude of the problem that we face. The first is the legacy structural weakness issues that the region faced, meaning what they brought into not having solved, not having addressed at the beginning of the pandemic. We can call that yesterday. Then there's the today problem of the pandemic and how wide-ranging was the influence of the pandemic. And then the third is the tomorrow problem, which is captured well by the vulnerabilities going forward from climate change. And when I call it a perfect storm is because all three of those are linked. The solution to where we are requires us to see how all three things come together and to highlight the idea that you cannot tackle one without keeping an eye on the other two. And so that makes it a very complex circumstance to look at. And so because of that conjuncture of the past, today, and tomorrow, we are looking at this as a three-part solution to the problems that we face. One is, how do we tackle rescue? That's dealing with today. How do we tackle recovery, which is the immediate short term? And how do we tackle repositioning, which is putting us onto a different trajectory that takes care of not only the problems unsolved, but equally the problems emerging. And to be able to do those three things, we believe the policy set of instruments has to be tailored to be specific to each of those dimensions of the problem that we face. And likewise, the financing requirements need to be the same. So for example, the rescue needs require fast disbursing emergency type funding that address things like vaccinations, that talk about sustaining livelihoods and keeping social protection high on and maintaining productive capacity. When you move into the recovery mode, we are almost talking a sense of fiscal forbearance. How do we allow governments to meet those expenses to allow us to begin to recover without jeopardizing the longer-term sustainability elements that they need to focus on? And once we move into the repositioning mode, that's not going to be sequential, but has to be done in parallel with the recovery and rescue mode, is how do you reposition for comparative advantage in a state that would allow you to grow potential. And that means for us tackling maybe the one problem that the region has. And that problem is, we can call it loosely, an inadequate amount of resilience. And it spans both what got us to the legacy, how we have reacted to the pandemic, and how we expect to manage the climate-related issues going forward. And that resilience we are looking at, because of the nature of the complexity, one of a ecosystem. So we call it a resilience ball, a resilience ecosystem that has 5 dimensions. First is social resilience, looking about people, their health, their education, their mindset. There's institutional resilience. How do you strengthen institutions coming out of any impact? There is the environmental resilience, which is what I think the world is seized on now in terms of building resilience against climate change. But then there's also production capacity resilience, which is the bane of the existence of all islands, especially after they are impacted by things like hurricanes or volcanoes or floods. When your capacity to produce is decimated, how do you get out of that? And the last element we have is financial resilience, which literally undergirds all of those, your ability to have enough finance to meet all of those resilience buckets. And in fact, that is almost the tipping point as to why we have not been able to put ourselves in a different space. And so that's the context in which we see this. And you mentioned in terms of vulnerability. Vulnerability is an aspect of all of the resilience buckets that we talk about. And where we believe there is need for a rethink of how we ought to take this forward is through the concept of what we are calling recovery duration adjustments. And that is, in a specific application, one way of unlocking the absence or lack of adequate access to finance that arises in the case of small island states that are deemed to be high income. And if I can give you a very quick line on how this works, if you have a high middle income per capita of, say, 10,000, before an event occurs, you are shut out from concessionary or low-cost financing purely because your income per capita is so high. But the problem is that when you are hit by a natural hazard that becomes a disaster, it essentially, in the case of a hurricane, for example, brings you back not from 10,000 to 9,000, but maybe 9,000 to $2,500, $3,000 per capita. Why? Not only because your capital stock is decimated, not only because it will take time to recover it, but the duration from the hit that you take in your loss of economic welfare to the length of time to get you back to where you were before that hit is at least 3-4 times the length it takes for any developed country to actually emerge. And so what you really need is a way of adjusting that pre-event per capita GNI to an adjusted per capita GNI, which certainly takes into account the measurement of resilience and vulnerability. And as long as you could do this, then you have a more equitable, more appropriate way of incorporating resilience into access to finance metrics. And that's one of the things CDB is working on now, and we are proposing to the broader international community that we all know GNI is not adequate. But we did not have a good way of characterizing this. And now we are saying if we can model, measure, building in a forward-looking, dynamic way, based upon strong theory, a way of converting the duration to recovery into a hard number that reduces and adjusts your GNI per capita, then we believe it would provide seeds with a much more, as I said, equitable way of adjusting to some of the malfortunes that we face as we seek to grow from the very elements that we're talking of. Yeah.
And you're touching on, I think, your vulnerability index work there, which is very interesting. And maybe we'll come back and talk on that later.
Sure.
Maybe if I can just turn then to VP Mourinho. What can a public institution like the EIB do to help overcome these bottlenecks in climate resilient development? And then secondly, what can be done to unlock the billions in climate finance to ensure that these projects are implemented quickly and to the requisite level of quality in your view?
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, and I'd like to compliment my fellow panelists, and it's a great pleasure to be here in such a high-level discussion. Well, the two questions that you're raising, it's one not easier than the other, but I'll try to address them in sequence. First, how to help to overcome bottlenecks? Well, it's clear that there's an implementation deficit. There are large needs, there are quite some billions, and we need to make it match. But to make it match, we need to have good and resilient projects. And that's the key. And to build good and resilient projects, you need to have good technical assistance, such that you build solid technical projects. You need to have good governance of these projects, such that we are using taxpayers' money in the best way possible. Because in the end of the day, what you're doing is using taxpayers' money to protect citizens from the disasters that may come in the future. And to use the best way taxpayers' money, you need to justify every cent that we spend and to show to the citizens that it's in their best interest. And that's why we at EIB have such a high standards for governance, for compliance, for technical due diligence. And that's what needs and takes time. How we can improve this? We can improve this by improving the time to market. And this means that we need projects that reach faster the stage at which they can be put on the terrain. Because you're right, if money is not being used, is not being disbursed, it will not work. Only the money that is being made to use to put in place these projects will have an impact. And that's the key. The key is not spending billions, it's about having the impact that these billions can bring to reality. And that's exactly where we are. So we need technical assistance, and the European Commission and the European Union is putting forward quite a significant amount of money for technical assistance. And us at the EIB, we are working with regional development banks, with CDB, but also with other regional development banks, and these grants for technical assistance are simply crucial. I would say that to make it, to do more and do it faster, we need additional, and of course that donors can have here a very important and prominent role in bringing more and more technical assistance such that we can bring projects to market faster. Then it needs to be clear what adaptation means and to bring adaptation to reality. And for this, tomorrow we'll announce the EIB adaptation plan, and we're going to triple the amount of funding we are putting to adaptation. That is, I would say, a big challenge for us, because adaptation projects are hard to build, and we need to do it in a very solid manner. Just think about this. Well, we We have good examples of what resilience means. You have bridges in Europe made by the time of the Roman Empire that lasts till today. So these guys, 2,000 years ago, were very concerned on resilience. But you also see in the news that many disasters took people because they think they are in a safe place, in a safe infrastructure, and then you realize that the infrastructure collapses because it was not properly built and technically solid. So we need to take these two examples and try to do resilient infrastructures, technically solid, such that we can protect people using taxpayers' money to protect people. Just to conclude, we are launching today the Emerging Market Climate Action Fund. It's a collaboration between EIB, Allianz, the Luxembourgish government, the German government. This is 500 million for renewable energy, energy efficiency, but also adaptation. I would say that is putting money where our words are. But we need to do it in a solid manner to protect people from future disasters. And of course that small island states is a key region, key areas to address. They are not just facing climate action, they are facing an existential threat. And we need to stand side by side with these countries and supporting them.
Thank you very much indeed, Vice President. And I think the NCAF fund there that you just described is really a very interesting and exciting way of trying to address some of these issues that we've been talking about here today. Now let me turn to you, Mr. Puig. From your perspective, you're living on the front line there, of course, in Dominican Republic. From your perspective, what challenges does the Dominican Republic face, and when it comes to adapting to climate change, and how are you actually tackling these at the moment?
En primer lugar, gracias por la oportunidad de poder responder a estas preguntas participando en este panel.
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to respond to your questions in this panel.
Debo decir que República Dominicana tiene una economía muy dinámica y nosotros hemos podido trabajar en la identificación de nuestras necesidades.
I should say that the Dominican Republic has a very dynamic economy, and we have the opportunity to work with our opportunities.
Por eso, en nuestra contribución nacionalmente determinada, en nuestra NDC, nosotros establecimos con claridad cuáles eran nuestros objetivos, tanto en términos de mitigación como de adaptación.
That's why in our new NDC, we made it clear which are our objectives in mitigation and so at the same time in adaptation.
Nosotros en nuestra NDC fijamos, bueno, es una NDC ya ampliada, con una ambición reforzada, en la que nosotros incluimos un plan de adaptación. Es decir, hemos logrado establecerlo porque incluso ya teníamos desde antes un trabajo hecho. República Dominicana tiene un Plan Nacional de Adaptación desde el año 2016.
In this new NDC, we made it clear our adaptation commitment to the international cooperation. Our first NDC didn't have the adaptation component, and this new NDC made it clear that adaptation was very important. It includes an adaptation component and make reference to our adaptation plan that is from 2016.
Y ahora estamos trabajando en el plan de acción de esa NDC.
Now we're working in an action plan of that NDC, of our new NDC.
Pero además nosotros tenemos una visión muy clara en el sentido de que la cuestión climática es absolutamente transversal y queremos llevarla a todos los niveles del gobierno y de la sociedad a través de las instancias de planificación del gobierno.
And we are very conscious that the adaptation, we want to make it cross-cutting in the whole government, and not only the government, but the whole society.
Pero no solamente a todos los niveles del gobierno, pensando en el gobierno como gobierno central, sino a los diferentes niveles de gobierno, insistiendo en los gobiernos locales y en la participación de los diferentes sectores de la sociedad en el plan de adaptación.
But not only at the upper side of the government, like in the central part, we want to make cross-cutting adaptation in a vertical way, working with the municipalities and the local governments, and saying that with all the sectors of the society.
Y eso nos ha permitido determinar para el año 2030 cuáles son las necesidades de la República Dominicana, tanto en términos de mitigación como en términos de adaptación.
And the work made in our NDC have made it clear which are our needs and necessity of mitigation and also in adaptation until 2030.
Es decir, que nosotros ya sabemos lo que tenemos que hacer, aunque cada vez debemos precisar mejor lo que vamos a hacer.
Meaning that we know what we have to do, even though we have each time to be more precisely in our steps.
Pero ahí se nos presenta una dificultad. Necesitamos recursos y necesitamos también poder acceder a esos recursos.
But we have a need that we need to access to funding, and we need the capacity to access to those fundings.
Y el tema de la capacidad tiene que ver con el hecho de poder responder a todos los requerimientos para acceder a esos fondos disponibles. Hay un aspecto en esto que es un aspecto técnico. A veces los requerimientos son bastante precisos, bastante detallados, y no tenemos todos los elementos.
Meaning this, that we need to access this funding, and sometimes we need the capacity to build the feasibility research, all the paperwork that goes before we can access those fundings, and we don't have the technical capacity to do that.
Bueno, y no es que no tenemos capacidades, pero no todas las capacidades, y ahí es donde necesitamos un complemento, necesitamos un reforzamiento de esas capacidades para poder responder en tiempo a las necesidades.
It's not that we don't have the capacity, it's that we don't have the enough capacity in time to respond in time and quickly to those call-ins.
Porque todos sabemos que los fenómenos atmosféricos extremos, por ejemplo, son cada vez más frecuentes, cada vez más poderosos, cada vez más destructivos y cada vez menos previsibles.
Because we know that the atmospheric events are each time more frequently, they make more impact in our country, and each time they're less predictable.
Entonces, el tema nuestro es poder responder a tiempo, porque los fenómenos del cambio climático van muy rápido. Entonces, nosotros tenemos que acelerar también nuestro paso.
So the thing is that we need to accelerate our pace, and we need to be more resilient. So when this storm comes to our country, we know how to react, and we'll be more prepared.
Bueno, eso es lo que yo les podría decir al respecto.
And that's what I could tell you about that.
Thank you very much. Maybe you could say a few words as well about the work that you're doing in the National Council for Climate Change. Presumably that's where your action plan is being developed and you're using your experience and so on.
¿Qué estamos haciendo en el Consejo de Cambio Climático ahora mismo? ¿Cómo?
Yo creo que esto es muy importante porque cada país define su gobernanza climática de manera diferente.
So this is very important because each country defines the climate governance in a different way.
Hay países que han escogido que sea su Ministerio de Economía el que se ocupe de dirigir la lucha contra el cambio climático.
Some countries have chosen their Ministry of Economics to lead their climate change path.
En otro caso, a veces es el Ministro del Medio Ambiente.
Sometimes it's the Environment Ministry.
En fin, cada país decide de manera distinta.
Every country chooses his own way.
En el caso de República Dominicana, nosotros hemos creado un consejo.
In the case of the Dominican Republic, we have created a council.
Y ese consejo está presidido por el propio presidente de la República.
That council is under the president of the Dominican Republic.
Y en ese consejo hay muchos ministerios importantes.
And under that council conforms all the main ministries that have to do with climate change.
Las oficinas técnicas del consejo que yo dirijo, las dirijo como vicepresidente ejecutivo, porque el presidente es el presidente de la República.
So the office that I preside I'm the vice president, but the president of that council is the president of the Dominican Republic.
Y eso significa que República Dominicana, al manejar de esa manera la cuestión climática, le está asignando un rango muy importante, muy alto.
this way, the Dominican Republic give a high-level responsibility to the climate change topic.
Yo, por ejemplo, no soy ministro, pero coordino ministerios por delegación del Presidente de la República.
I'm not a minister, but I make a coordination of all the ministers by the order of the President.
Y esto con una visión muy participativa, es decir, con una participación importante, no solo del gobierno central y local, sino con una participación importante del sector productivo, empresarial, de las universidades y de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil.
And I'm not talking about the government, the central government, or the municipalities. We're talking about private sector, the civil organizations such as universities and NGOs.
Y todo lo que hacemos, lo hacemos de manera concertada.
So everything that we do in a participatory way.
Thank you very much indeed. That's quite a challenge you have there, and a very interesting time ahead of you. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on that. Ambassador Wasilewski, apologies for keeping you so long. Come to you, if I may, from an EU perspective. What social and economic challenges have you observed in the region linked to climate change, and how does the EU respond to these challenges?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's very good to join you, even if it's only virtual. First of all, in terms of social and economic challenges, I think it is very important, as my predecessors have already stressed, how interconnected it all is. You cannot isolate one aspect of climate change in the region and treat it separately, because it's all interdependent. So in most cases, we think of hurricanes. They have been more frequent and much more severe in the region, even in the last 5 years where I've been in the region, and EU responds to them with what we call humanitarian assistance. So fast response, providing shelter, water, helping with regaining access to power, food, whatever it is. But it isn't just hurricanes, and of course they are extremely serious. The region has been experiencing extremely heavy rains, which cause landslides, which affect food security, which destroy people's shelters and infrastructure. Unexpected, long and severe droughts, which again have impact on food security. Systematically rising temperatures, loss of land, as you know, these are mostly very small islands, and so on and so on. But many people don't think of other aspects of climate change, such as sargassum. If you think of these huge, almost islands of this seaweed floating on the oceans, they come to the shores of the Caribbean, they affect the reef, they can be very huge, off-putting, smelly, therefore they affect tourism, which has impact on jobs, which creates higher vulnerability and again, increased societal risks and so on. So when you think of the social and economic challenges, they are so interconnected that it's difficult to look at any aspect alone. And of course, the pandemic has shown us of incredible vulnerability of the health systems and health infrastructure. So how do we respond to it? And let me again stress that these are mostly small societies with small capacities with very little diversity of income to their economy. So they're hit very, very quickly. And the last couple of years in particular have shown how big that impact can be on the vulnerabilities of the society. So as I said, as EU, we have the fast response in terms of humanitarian assistance, and we're pretty well set up for that. And we work very closely with our member states and with other international institutions and other partners. But we also work very strongly on adaptation and helping the countries adjust to living with the ever-changing new conditions brought by climate change. But as they rethink and reinvent themselves, if another disaster strikes, their economies can be wiped out, not only back to where they started, but even set them below zero. So it really is a huge challenge, and we mustn't see that as as a single problem alone. And as you said, Prime Minister Motley stressed that it is a matter of not only livelihoods, but existence of these societies. So adaptation cannot be the only solution. But we try to work with partner countries and with regional agencies by responding to what they identify as the greatest needs. That's how the donors work today. So any aspect that the given administration or the region sees as their weakest point, we will try to work out how our assistance can help. So supporting the capacities of the regional agencies to predict, to respond to all these challenges better and quicker, to be able to release funds either nationally or regionally, or working with international financial institutions to make sure that the funds can be released faster with less red tape in order to assist. But we also work on making hospitals and clinics more climate proof. We help the countries to rebuild the shelters and the housing and the infrastructure according to better specs, and therefore more resilient. We provide all kinds of technical assistance and advisory and financial assistance to governments so they can respond quicker. We also work on sustainable water project, green energy, and on all of these, we work very closely with partners, with regional development banks, with EIB, as I said, with agencies and many others. I will not be able to list everybody that we work with. I'm not going to go into the numbers of the funds. You do know that we are the biggest donor, and together with EIB's loans, I hope our support and funding to the region and its vulnerabilities will increase in years to come. We're very serious about helping the region. But again, adaptation will not solve all the problems alone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You referred again there to the existential threat, which becomes more profound every time I hear it. Panelists, I wonder whether you'd like to respond to any of the points made by any of the other panelists, perhaps, President.
Thank you, Stephen. Just I wanted to follow up on a point made by the latest speaker, and that's to deal with mitigation and adaptation. The way I understand it, in a very simple way, mitigate means you slow down, you reduce capacity of something that's evolving from impacting you or making it impact you less. That does not solve your problem. And in a sense, if it doesn't solve your problem, time catches up with you, and you are still faced down the road with that problem that you need to solve. And therefore, adaptation to the new circumstance, if you can predict it, is almost inevitable. I think the situation we have now is, especially in the climate sense, and it holds across all areas of resilience, but if we just think of climate, the problem we have now is 25%, at least 2019, and maybe the same holds for 2020, 25% of all funds that have actually been channeled have actually gone to adaptation. And so it is this pivoting, or the need for pivoting towards adaptation, because we do know on current trends, adaptation will catch up with you, and you have no choice but to adapt. Mitigation is not going to be fast enough to be able to slow you down. And so how do we get there? How do we mobilize enough financing, enough projects, enough in-crowding of the private sector to supplement and build with the public sector, because no one can do it. It has to be a concerted effort, national and international, coordinated in a way that gets you to the point where you can adapt to meet the new reality of tomorrow, I think is really the existential threat that we face.
Sí. Bueno, yo pienso que hay algo fundamental en todo esto. Un país como República Dominicana emite muy pocos gases de efecto invernadero. solo el 0.06% del total del mundo.
I will say that, in particular in our case, the Dominican Republic only emits 0.06% of all the green gases of the whole world.
Pero, como país insular en desarrollo, formamos parte de los países que más sufren los efectos negativos del cambio climático.
But as a small development state, we're one of the countries that suffer all the worst impacts of the climate change.
Nosotros compartimos el criterio de que estamos frente a responsabilidades compartidas pero diferenciadas.
We stand by the principle that we share our responsibilities, but they are different, they are not quite the same.
Y por eso cumplimos. Nosotros tratamos de ser responsables con la mitigación.
That's why we're trying to be responsible with the mitigation part.
En la NDC precedente de República Dominicana, nosotros teníamos la ambición de reducir las emisiones en un 25%, pero todo era condicionado.
In our old NDC, the first NDC, we have the responsibility to reduce 25% of our emissions, but they were conditioned.
Ahora tenemos 27%, pero solo 20 de ese 27 es condicionado.
Now we made a commitment of 27%, but only 20 is conditioned.
Porque 7% ahora es responsabilidad nacional, aunque no recibamos apoyo.
But we committed that 7% of that 27 is national responsibility, even though we don't receive any support.
Queremos aumentar esa proporción.
And we wanted to increase that proportion.
Pero al mismo tiempo necesitamos apoyo para la adaptación.
But at the same time, we need support with the adaptation part.
Y como sabemos lo que tenemos que hacer,
Because we know what we have to do.
el apoyo fundamental también es aprender más, saber más, conocer mejor cómo acceder a los fondos. Por eso es que necesitamos ese apoyo, si se quiere, ese apoyo técnico.
And the support that we need is to get to know more the funds, how we get access to those funds more quickly and better. That's why we need that technical support.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, I wonder if you would like to come back on any of the points that have been made.
What I wanted to pick up on is the need to attract investment. I think the impact of the pandemic is such that the budgets for grants for all donors will probably be smaller for the coming years. Attracting investments and supporting the public-private partnerships, which are already quite well developed across the region, can bring not only stronger linkages between bigger countries and the region, but can have a huge impact. But there are two challenges. One is economies of scale. For many investors, these countries are too small. Therefore, potential profits are not as big as elsewhere. They're quite isolated, so logistics can be a challenge to many. And there's another challenge in the region, and that is ease of doing business. These are small countries with small capacities, with often slightly outdated bureaucracies, a lot of red tape and paperwork, and there are efforts to change that, but it does, again, put people off from investing in the region. However, we, for example, in Europe also have a lot of small countries. One of my ambitions would be to connect the small countries from Europe with small countries from the region, because the impact of those investments can be enormous on whole societies. And we have so much expertise to share. And if we could have combined investment from the region and from outside, in my case, of course, I'm most interested in attracting it from Europe, but I will not hold sole rights to that. The most important thing is that it has impact on people. And we can do a lot with relatively small things. You know, there's plenty to be done with solar power, with wind power, but the countries are too small to be able to carry the burden of such huge investment themselves.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you're touching there on the scale of finance that's required. And I think it's apparent that that can't just come from the public sector. So I wondered, Vice President, if you might just touch on the private sector side of it and what maybe we can do or the EIB can do as a bank to attract that private investment.
Well, thank you, Stefan. I think that the needs that we face are in fact huge. And we are facing a global challenge that needs a global response. When it comes to small island the developing states, I think, of course, and as suggested by President León and just expressed by the ambassador, we have a market failure. We have small countries with small capacity, and that by themselves and by, let's say, through the market mechanisms cannot bring to life what is needed. So there's a clear case for a global response by entities and by states that can provide the seeds for these places to grow. And of course, that after the COVID, there was a huge stress on the fiscal side of all countries around the world. But for the small island states, it's even harsher because we have economies that don't have that much diversification, where tourism plays a role. And this COVID pandemic was just terrible. And people used to say that every crisis is a good opportunity, which is a statement I really don't like, because this crisis was something really terrible. I prefer to say that every cloud has a silver lining. So we have paid a huge price. So better now we try to find something that we can take out of this for the future. And one thing is clear, there is room to do more. And I pretty much concur with the ambassador that it's not just about adaptation and mitigation. It's about delivering to the people. And we need, of course, to take this crisis to change the way our countries work. And if I can give a hint, we need to define, or you need to define for the Caribbean region priorities. And these priorities should, of course, be focused around climate, that's key, but also digitalization, and take advantage of digitalization, in fact, to make governance of the countries and the state more efficient and improve the business environment. And if you improve the business environment, then you'll attract private investment. That's the only way we can tackle this issue. Of course, that public resources can play a role. And I used to say that the public resources play the role as this potion of panoramics, so the druid of Asterix. You can have a small drop, and then it makes private money much more powerful. That's how I see the action of EU beyond, of the European Commission and the European Union, beyond EU borders. We should be there to support and to create the conditions for the private sector to participate and to crowd in resources such that countries can endogenously develop the seeds of their future growth, of course taking into account fragilities and taking into account that if they have their endogenous growth, if disasters come, we need to mitigate them, we need to give a response. But the capacity to get on their feet again and produce and deliver to their citizens is there.
And President León, maybe if I could just ask you then, how are you concretely helping the small businesses that are so impacted by this? You know, the fishermen and the microfinance enterprises and so on. How is that kind of filtering down to that level from your perspective?
Well, one is you start by recognizing the fisheries as an extension of the very climate-related problems that you face. Whether it starts with watershed land management issues down to the coastal areas, and in terms of your overall biodiversity and remapping this. So pivoting onto that particular aspect through appropriate support, financial and other, as a means of mobilizing and strengthening their ability in terms of fisheries and agriculture generally to be able to grow and provide the means for better livelihoods and sustenance. But I think I want to link this to the point I think both the Vice President and the Ambassador have made, and that's the enablers, that we cannot make second tier. They should be at the first tier, whether it's on governance, broadly speaking, or on the ability to be nimble through implementation capacity, or the digital transformation that we are talking about that will help us to pivot, or embracing elements of even just simply how we view ourselves as competitive entities in a global space. These are necessary to do the one key thing that will allow private sector to enter the space, which is to de-risk. The market failure you referred to is occurring because the risk is just too high. And unless you can find ways of reducing or de-risking that element, the private sector cannot find it as attractive. Even if we say scaling is necessary, scaling still requires a reduction in risk. And so when the ambassador talks about broadly seeing, enabling the environment, doing business, strengthening governance, these are all elements that help to minimize or de-risk. And if I look in terms of, let's say, just simply the way I organize, the way we provide the means of the supply chain for the fisherman, through to getting to the livelihood aspect of income. If these are not there, the risk is still too high. The market cannot survive. But you cannot pass it on to the government because governments don't have the capacity. And even if they try to take it on, you simply swap one problem with another problem of a fiscal problem. And so for me, almost the entire game in town is how do you put policies together that can help reduce risk, immediate, short-term, and long-term, because that's the only way the market can actually reward you in a tangible way that's sustainable over time.
And if I may, I'd just like to give a shout out there again to the MCAF fund, which was launched today, which is effectively a public-private partnership. It's so important to de-risk, and de-risking is at the heart of that. Presumably, you would echo those sentiments, Mr. Puig.
Con mucho gusto. Yo estoy de acuerdo con todo lo que se acaba de señalar. Necesitamos recursos, pero no se trata solo de recursos, se trata de todo un ambiente, y ese ambiente supone gobernabilidad, supone estabilidad y supone condiciones que desarrollen la confianza del sector privado.
So, I am in accord with everything that you're saying, but we not only need resources, we need a series of items like governance, resources, and for the private sector to implement.
Porque hablamos siempre del ecosistema, pero también hay un ecosistema social, un ecosistema económico y un ecosistema político.
Because we talk about environment, but not only environment, we have a social environment and political environment and economical environment.
Y necesitamos proteger todos esos ecosistemas.
And we need to protect all of those environments.
Para poder tener la capacidad de hacer lo que debemos hacer.
To have the capacity to do what we have to do.
We're getting a little bit short on time, but if I may throw in a bit of a curveball for each of you. I was just going to ask, if there's one single thing that you would all wish for to happen within, let's give it a reasonable time frame, let's say within the next year, to address, the specific issues you have at hand. What would that one single thing be that would have most impact from your perspective?
From the climate side, I think I would say we need to rebuild confidence that the international community really appreciates and can commit to helping move towards a better space from a climate side. And that means simply living up to the commitments that have been made with regard to helping to finance. That I think for me is the beginning. It has to be the catalyst that says we have confidence things are changing. I think if you can do that, then it will catalyze a number of other things like private sector, or for that matter, governments feeling they can do a little more. They will not be stuck out on a limb. That can actually begin to take us to another space. Now that, as the minister just said, that is only one slice of the problem. You probably do need to have a similar aspect of each of what I call my 5 buckets of resilience, something tackling in each of those: social, political, production, capacity, and so on, as a means of giving you enough momentum for that entire ecosystem to move together. But I would start with building just the confidence that the world is not about to end, that somehow we are beginning to turn the corner, and there is genuine commitment going forward.
Vice President, if I could turn to you. Sorry to throw you the curveball there.
I would say 2 words: engagement and commitment. I would say I think that this pandemic, in fact, moves us far apart in the sense that we are not able to engage, to see each other. I think we need to now that the pandemic seems to be taming down, we need again to meet each other, engage, and act quickly and fiercely to make things happen. That's, in my view, the key issue for the recovery, not of just Europe, but of the global economy.
Perfect, thank you.
Lo que pienso es que ahora estamos hablando mucho del largo plazo, del 2050. Y claro, la visión de largo plazo tiene que ser estratégica. Pero
Sorry, now we're talking about long-term, like a long-term strategy. But now I think that our long-term strategy needs to be more strategic.
Pero para que haya largo plazo, tiene que haber corto plazo. Si no hay corto plazo, no habrá largo plazo.
But to the long term, to be a reality, we need to have short-term reality actions.
Y ahí, ese es el tema de la acción climática.
And that's the topic of the climate action.
Entonces, ¿qué quiero yo para el año próximo?
What will I want for next year?
Bueno, yo quiero, sí, una mayor celeridad, una buena disposición, en este caso, de los bancos de desarrollo.
I would like a goodwill from the development banks, a more speed processes.
Pero nosotros también necesitamos desarrollar más capacidad. Necesitamos tener objetivos claros y apoyo para el desarrollo de esa capacidad.
But we need to develop more quickly our capacity and have better, more precise objectives.
Entonces yo quiero más apertura de la parte de los bancos, pero también quiero más capacidad para nosotros, para que esos 2 elementos converjan en nuevas acciones.
So I wish that the multilateral banks give us more opening, but I also are willing for having more capacity, national capacity and technical capacity, so those 2 things can combine and have a better outcome.
Okay, and then just very lastly, if I may, to Minister Puig and the President, I mean, you know, as small and developing states, you're living in the region, are you encouraged by what you are hearing this week at COP so far? Are you going to go away feeling infused by what you hear?
I think definitely we have to feel encouraged. We have to be very open because in my mind, what the pandemic and the current state of the climate change evolution is telling us is we have no choice. We have to embrace and do whatever we can. It is just a matter of how much can we do, how quickly. And so there is no room for us to not be encouraged. However small, however big, in between, we ought to embrace it and see how we can make the most of it. So absolutely, I am encouraged. Absolutely, I am optimistic. But it will depend a lot on us, how we make use of whatever support that is pledged, that is promised, that we can do, And we have to be able to take that responsibility to deliver on it. Yeah.
Ambassador, maybe if I could have your view.
Thank you. I thought you forgot me. I was going to claim my wish as well. And since I'm speaking last, I have two. One, maybe a little bit less realistic, but nevertheless, it can mean that's what wishes are about. I would love to see us all cutting more red tape and bureaucracy. And I'd like to congratulate EIB in particular for making some of the procedures much simpler in accessing funds for to work on the impact of the pandemic. Thank you very much for that. I would love to see a lot more of that in my own house, because we don't have 3 or 4 years to see implementation of a project when we need the impact of it now. Probably more realistic is that in the next year, I really hope I'll be able to attract attention and engagement of 2 or 3 member states of the European Union that haven't really been working closely with the region. And it doesn't have to be about grant money. It can be about all kinds of other cooperation addressing climate issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Time's indicating there that we need to draw to a close now. So I hope those watching and listening have found it interesting. I certainly have. Thank you so much for all my panelists, Ambassador, Minister Puig, Vice President Mourinho, President León. I think it's clear enough what the challenges are ahead of us. I think you have the coalition of willing around you here, and virtually joining us as well there today. So thank you very much indeed. I mean, we as a bank have active operations with the CDB for climate purposes, and I'm very encouraged by the adaptation plan that Vice President Mourinho referred to earlier. This really is about us. I mean, we've been mainstreaming climate adaptation for a long time, but this is really about us going to the next level, if you like, and seriously increasing the level of attention that we give to adaptation. So I'm really looking forward to, it's my responsibility actually to operationalize this, so I'm looking forward to that over the next year or so. And just like to thank you all once again, and we'll call it a day there. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.